Hello, this is Jim Edlin with some thoughts on the Foundry Publishing lesson for June 14, 2026. Its title is a question: Hate your parents? This is the second lesson in our series of hard sayings of the New Testament. These are not only hard to understand, but sometimes really hard to accept and to do. Our focus scriptures for this week include several different passages: Matthew 10, 37 through 39, and then Luke 14, 26, and then again in Luke 9, 23 through 27. In each of these, Jesus talks about what it means to follow him. So our essential truth for this session is that Jesus challenges his followers to pledge their total allegiance to him. And our goal then is that we might become people who put Jesus and his kingdom before any other relationships. Well, a hard saying today is, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. Luke 14, 26. Well, I don't know about you, but I really like my family. I was blessed with a good and godly parents, with a beautiful and loving wife, 3 remarkable and, of course, above average children, and my brother and sister. They've been wonderful examples of how to follow Jesus. So why would Jesus want me to hate them? And you probably noticed, it sounds like Jesus is telling his followers to break the 5th commandment: honor your father and mother. Would Jesus tell us to break one of the 10 commandments? Didn't he come to fulfill the law and not abolish it? So how can we honor our parents and then hate them at the same time? Let's look a little more closely at what Jesus said and try to understand what he meant by it. And I will admit to you, it's not an easy lesson to teach because of the different verses, but maybe this approach will help. I'd like to start out with looking at Luke 14:26, the hard saying, and see the context in which he spoke this. Passage begins in verse 25 by telling us that large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and then he turned and spoke these words to them, and other words that followed, about the cost of following him. First of all, the cost of family. He said, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, and on. This is such a shocking statement, even more so for the people that were surrounding Jesus than perhaps even it could be for us today. I mean, in the first century, those families were extremely important. This is the essence of their personal identity. Who else would they be if they're not the son of Benjamin or the daughter of Benjamin? In that family, and the foundation of security and hope for their future was all wrapped up in their family. Well, the truth is that following Jesus could cost us our families. It certainly did Jesus himself, and in other cases of Christianity throughout the centuries, it has cost people their families. The question, what would it mean to you to give up your family in order to follow Jesus? Well, the next thing that Jesus mentions in the verse following, in verse 27, is the cost of your reputation. He says, whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Cross, of course, as you may remember, is a symbol of humiliating death, total loss of status and reputation. It was capital punishment designed for maximum suffering and humiliation for slaves and enemies of Rome. People were stripped naked and nailed to the crossbeam for days until they suffocated to death or died by exposure. Question we might ask ourselves, what might be a symbol of our reputations and status? And what would it mean to us to give that up in order to follow Jesus? Jesus continued on in verses 28 through 32 with some illustrations about counting the cost of major decisions. He says in verse 28, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you sit down first and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? And then in verse 32, he says, suppose a king is about to go to war. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he's able? So the context of this hard saying of Jesus about the family is in the Gospel of Luke. It's about counting the cost of discipleship, thinking about what it means to follow Jesus. So let me ask you, have you ever thought about what you may need to give up in order to follow Jesus? What will it cost you? Well, let's turn over to Matthew chapter 10 and verses 37 through 39, where we find a parallel saying to this saying in Luke. As you know, we have 4 Gospels that often repeat the same stories and sayings of Jesus. And I know you may get tired of reading the same thing over again, but often those parallels are very, very helpful. And in this case, it certainly is. For as we read in Matthew's Gospel, he says, anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Well, Matthew records the words loves more than me, while Luke records hates. Why did Luke write down hate? Well, it's probably because that's exactly what Jesus said. Hate sometimes is used in Scripture with a sort of a double meaning. To love less, not in terms of feelings, but in terms of preference. Could Jesus have intentionally used a word with a double meaning to get the attention of his audience? I think it's real possible. So here's a question for us. Did Luke's version of Jesus saying cause you to think a little more deeply about what it means to follow Jesus? Notice the context in Matthew chapter 10 of Matthew is actually instructions to disciples for their first mission. This is not a large crowd like it was in the Gospel of Luke. He says in these verses, the following verse, he says, whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Verse 38. Well, this is parallel to exactly what followed Luke 14:26. Whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Same challenge, to give up your reputation. The next verse in Matthew reads, whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. Most frequently repeated statement of Jesus in all of the Gospels. Isn't that interesting? And it is further clarification of what verse 38 is up to, or what it's talking about. Picking up your cross means giving up your life. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But the question for right now is, why would Jesus instruct his disciples to be slightly different than his instructions for the crowds? Why would Jesus keep repeating this same thing on different occasions? Something worth pondering and thinking about. Well then, let's go on to Luke chapter 9, verses 23 through 27. This will give us some further help in understanding hard saying of Jesus. It's a similar challenge, but again, a different setting. This time in Caesarea Philippi, toward the end of Jesus' ministry up in Galilee, after Peter has confidently confessed that Jesus is the Messiah. Then Jesus warns his disciples of his coming death and his resurrection. And at that point we read, then he said to them all, whoever wants to be my disciples must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for me will save it. So in this passage, Jesus calls his disciples to self-sacrifice. Notice the 3 things involved in self-sacrifice that Jesus mentions. Deny themselves, that is, set aside personal agenda, decide not to please ourselves, Maybe we ought to ask ourselves a question: what personal ideas and ambitions might I need to set aside in order to deny myself? The second thing Jesus mentioned is take up their cross daily, which we've seen before. That is surrendering personal reputation and status each day. I wonder, we might ask ourselves, what would that look like for us every day? And then he says the third thing is to follow me. In other words, just do what Jesus does. What did Jesus do? We might ask ourselves. Notice the reason for self-sacrifice. He says to find life in God. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it. Life is not found by grasping, but by giving, not by securing, but by surrendering. One of our commentators, Thomas Phillips, for this lesson said, and then he went on, this is the paradox of Christian formation. We find life by losing the self-centered quest to secure it. That's a complete reversal of the natural order, isn't it? Savers lose and losers win. We might ask ourselves, have you ever thought about this? When Jesus hung on the cross, was he a loser or was he a winner? Question again, what exactly does a person find when they surrender themselves to God? What did you experience when you surrendered yourself to God and his kingdom? Well, this is definitely a hard saying. It's not hard to understand, not only hard to understand, but also hard to do. Jesus calls us to hate our parents, but it's about counting the cost. It's about picking our priorities, and it's about sacrificing self, all for the sake of Christ and his kingdom. Yes, following Jesus brings many blessings, much hope, freedom, but it's not easy. May God help us put Jesus before any other relationship or ambition that we may have.